In the dust-choked lands of 12th century Tikrit, a child was born not into splendor, but into a world cracked by conflict. The year was 1137. His name was Yusuf, but the world would come to know him by another, Saladin. He wasn't born with a crown or command, only with a name and a lineage. His father, Nejm-ad-Din Ayyub, was a Kurdish officer of modest means, loyal to the rulers he served, and known more for his principles than his power. The family, exiled from Tikrit the very night of Yusuf's birth, journeyed through the dangerous veins of a fragmented Middle East, eventually finding sanctuary in Mosul, and later in Damascus. The world around him was violent and shifting, kingdoms rising and falling like sand blown by the desert winds. In his youth, Saladin was not marked for greatness. He studied theology, law, mathematics, and Arabic poetry, not warcraft. He listened more than he spoke, a boy drawn toward the wisdom of books rather than the clang of blades. But history doesn't always wait for readiness. Through his uncle Shirkuh, a general in the service of Nur ad-Din, ruler of Syria, young Yusuf was pulled into the machinery of war. He rode with armies not because he lusted for conquest, but because duty called, and family demanded. Those early years shaped him not by victory, but by observation. He saw the greed of men who led for glory, the collapse of alliances based on ambition, and the cruelty of war unmurred from cause. He began to see clearly what so many missed: power untempered by virtue was a fleeting fire, bright for a moment, but doomed to burn out. He learned from Nur ad-Din, a devout and disciplined man who believed that faith must guide the sword. Nur ad-Din wasn't perfect, but he gave Saladin a model of leadership that valued restraint, unity, and justice over brute force. Under him, Saladin absorbed the idea that war was a necessity, not a desire, a last resort when dignity and people were threatened. As Saladin matured, a tension grew inside him. He was expected to be a warrior, yet his heart leaned toward balance, not blood. He was no brute nor zealot. His strength came from his calm, his clarity, and a deepening sense that leadership was not about ruling others, it was about carrying the weight others could not. In Egypt, he would step reluctantly into that weight. First as a soldier under Shirkuh, then, unexpectedly, as vizier after Shirkuh's death. It was a position of immense responsibility and danger, especially for a Sunni Kurdish outsider in a Shia-dominated court. But even before he led, he governed himself. He refused the temptations of courtly indulgence, avoided palace conspiracies, and devoted himself to quiet reform. He did not shout to assert control, he simply acted with it. But all of this, the studies, the discipline, the tempered spirit, began with a boy born in exile. A boy who watched his father hold honor above comfort. A boy who had seen cities burn before he held a sword. He carried no hatred in him, even as hatred swirled across lands divided by cross and crescent. That was the difference. That was the root. Others were forged in ambition. He was shaped by principle. He would soon face storms that would test everything he believed. The Crusaders had already taken Jerusalem decades earlier, carving Christian kingdoms into the heart of the Islamic world. Battles would come. Armies would rise. He would be called to fight, to lead, and eventually to unify. But before any of that, there was just the quiet fire of a young man watching, learning, and waiting for the time when action, guided by faith and shaped by restraint, would become destiny. This was the foundation of the Lion of Mercy, not sharpened steel, but sharpened character. Not the thirst for power, but the refusal to let chaos reign. He was not the hero people expected. He was something far more rare. A man who never wanted a throne but earned one anyway. A leader who believed mercy was not weakness but the highest strength. Saladin's rise began not with a grand victory, but with a reluctant step into chaos. When his uncle Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, Saladin found himself appointed as vizier of Egypt. It was not a role he sought. He was young, an outsider in a divided Shia court, and viewed with suspicion by both allies and enemies. The Fatimid Caliphate was crumbling from within, riddled with betrayal, incompetence, and stagnation. Instead of seizing power through fear, Saladin chose reform. He cut back corruption, stabilized the treasury, restructured the army, and shifted the religious identity of the state towards Sunni Islam, doing it gradually to avoid revolt. His approach wasn't driven by fanaticism, but by the need for unity. Egypt had to become a fortress of faith and order, not a playground for opportunists. Despite conspiracies and assassination attempts, he never retaliated with unnecessary bloodshed. When rivals plotted, he offered forgiveness if they surrendered. When officials lied, he replaced them quietly. He wasn't naive, he was methodical. Every decision had purpose. Every move was calculated not for gain, but for longevity. He understood power was not a prize, it was a test. When the Fatimid Caliph died in 1171, Saladin officially aligned Egypt with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, ending the Fatimid dynasty. The moment was massive. Without shedding unnecessary blood, he had flipped the balance of power in the region. Yet he wore no crown. He declared no empire. He kept his focus on restoration, not expansion. That restraint drew respect. Men followed him not because they feared him, but because they trusted his discipline. But peace never lasts. After the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, Syria fractured. Competing warlords fought for influence in Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul. Many expected Saladin to remain in Egypt. Instead, he marched north, not for conquest, but for consolidation. Syria could not afford division with the Crusaders still embedded in the Holy Land. Saladin took city after city, not with cruelty, but with offers of protection, justice, and stability. People opened gates rather than raised walls. In Aleppo, resistance was strong, but eventually respect outweighed suspicion. The unification of Egypt and Syria under one ruler was no small feat. It had never been done peacefully. Saladin did it in under a decade. He didn't rely on overwhelming strength. He used patience, diplomacy, religious legitimacy, and selective force. And when force was required, he used it swiftly and without excess. Meanwhile, the Crusader kingdoms to the west watched with growing concern. They saw not just a threat to territory, but to their influence. Saladin was no longer just a local commander. He was becoming a symbol. His armies, once fragmented, now marched under a single banner. His rule stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. But still, he didn't declare himself caliph. He didn't proclaim empire. He didn't erect golden statues or demand titles. He focused on readiness. His internal policies were equally sharp. He lowered taxes for farmers, strengthened the economy, improved supply lines for the army, and maintained religious schools to train scholars and administrators. Governance was never an afterthought. While others celebrated temporary victories, Saladin built permanence. His leadership wasn't performative, it was deeply rooted in the mechanics of sustainability. He surrounded himself with honest advisors, not flatterers. He dismissed lazy commanders regardless of status. He personally oversaw welfare distribution in cities affected by famine or drought. His nights were spent reading scripture, not indulging in comfort. He donated from his own wealth to free prisoners of war. What he demanded from his people, he first demanded from himself. His sense of justice extended beyond borders. In cases where Crusader merchants were captured, he often ensured they were treated fairly, sometimes even released without condition. Not out of weakness, but because he understood that trust had diplomatic value. Every action, no matter how small, had purpose. Every mercy was an investment in a reputation that could move faster than armies. The groundwork had been laid. A unified state, a disciplined military, a loyal population. But he knew what was coming. War would return. The Crusaders would provoke, raid, and escalate. The kingdom of Jerusalem had become bold under men like Reynold of Chatillon, whose reckless cruelty would soon ignite a fire none could put out. Saladin wasn't simply reacting to aggression, he was preparing for a war of balance, where the stakes were not just land, but moral legitimacy. By 1186, the transformation was complete. The quiet, observant man who once rode in his uncle's shadow was now the most respected leader in the Muslim world. Not because he seized power, but because he never allowed it to consume him. He had become more than a ruler. He had become a force of stability. And soon, the world would watch as that force met the storm. By the late 1180s, the balance of power in the Levant had tilted. Saladin had unified Egypt and Syria, but his eyes were fixed on a larger goal: the liberation of Jerusalem. The city had been under Crusader control for nearly a century, taken in the First Crusade with brutal force. Saladin understood that reclaiming it would require more than armies. It demanded timing, discipline, and clarity of purpose. He didn't rush. Instead, he built alliances with other Muslim leaders, negotiated truces where possible, and focused on strengthening his military structure. Every region under his rule was expected to contribute, not just in soldiers, but in supplies, organization, and spiritual commitment. The fragile peace was shattered by reckless violence. Reynold of Chatillon, a notorious Crusader warlord, attacked Muslim caravans despite existing treaties. He even threatened to invade the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. For Saladin, this was not just a breach of law, it was an insult to dignity and faith. He issued a clear warning: if such acts continued, there would be no restraint. When Reynold struck again, this time targeting a peaceful caravan, Saladin acted. In 1187, the Crusader forces gathered near the village of Hattin, confident in their strength. Led by King Guy of Jerusalem, they believed they could crush Saladin's forces swiftly. But Saladin's preparations were precise. He controlled the water sources, drew the enemy into exposed terrain, and waited. As the Crusaders marched through heat and dust with limited supplies, their strength drained. When the moment came, Saladin attacked. The Battle of Hattin was not just a military victory, it was a dismantling of an entire Crusader strategy. Most of their leadership was captured. The True Cross, a sacred Christian relic, was taken. Reynold was executed for his repeated violations. King Guy was spared, a deliberate choice to show mercy, not submission. With the Crusader army broken, the path to Jerusalem opened. City after city surrendered without prolonged resistance. As Saladin's forces approached Jerusalem, the defenders prepared for a brutal siege. But what followed stunned the world. Rather than repeat the massacre that had occurred when the Crusaders captured the city in 1099, Saladin offered terms. Christians were allowed to ransom themselves, and those who couldn't pay were often released anyway. Religious sites were respected. No churches were destroyed. No mass slaughter followed. This moment didn't just mark the recapture of a city, it redefined what conquest could look like. Saladin's restraint wasn't political theater, it was the natural extension of his values. He believed justice secured longer peace than fear ever could. His treatment of prisoners, civilians, and even defeated commanders stood in stark contrast to the brutality that had become common. Diplomats from Europe recorded their surprise at the level of civility shown. The word spread quickly, even among those who had never met him. His reputation crossed borders faster than his armies. But the victories brought new challenges. The fall of Jerusalem triggered a massive reaction in Europe. The Pope called for a new crusade. Monarchs like Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip II of France answered. Saladin knew what was coming. These were not fragmented armies led by opportunists. These were the most powerful kings of Europe, commanding massive fleets, bringing professional soldiers, siege equipment, and resources unmatched in previous campaigns. Saladin did not underestimate them. He fortified cities, redistributed forces, and prepared for a prolonged campaign. He knew he could not rely on overwhelming strength alone. The coming war would be measured in endurance, strategy, and diplomacy. When Richard landed in the Holy Land, he immediately launched a series of successful campaigns, retaking Acre and winning the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin suffered setbacks, but never collapsed. He avoided open-field confrontations where his forces were outmatched and focused on protecting key supply lines and morale. The battles between Saladin and Richard were fierce, but they were also marked by mutual respect. Both leaders understood the stakes. They exchanged letters, negotiated prisoner releases, and occasionally paused fighting to tend to the wounded. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his own physician. These gestures didn't stop the war, but they defined its tone. This was no longer just a clash of swords, it was a contest of character. By 1192, either side had achieved total victory. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but much of the coast was back in Crusader hands. Exhausted, both leaders agreed to a truce. Pilgrims from the west could visit Jerusalem safely, and the immediate war ended. Saladin had not lost the city he had reclaimed, but he had prevented further bloodshed through negotiation. The Third Crusade had tested every aspect of his leadership. He had faced kings with vast armies, endured pressure from internal rivals, and navigated shifting alliances. Yet through it all, he maintained discipline, upheld his principles, and emerged as a figure admired by both enemies and allies. He had proven that true strength was not measured only in conquest, but in restraint, clarity, and enduring purpose. Saladin's victories in war earned him global recognition, but it was his conduct in peace that elevated him beyond the role of a mere military commander. Power never changed him. Despite controlling vast territories stretching from North Africa to Mesopotamia, he lived with simplicity. He refused the trappings of royalty, avoided extravagance, and slept on coarse mats rather than silk. His personal wealth remained modest because he gave most of it away. His position didn't isolate him, it connected him to the poor, the sick, and the displaced. Charity wasn't a gesture, it was embedded in his daily life. His humility extended to how he governed. Unlike rulers who sought domination through fear, Saladin led through fairness. When ruling over populations with different faiths, he ensured freedom of worship, protection of churches, and the safety of religious minorities. He believed dignity wasn't negotiable. Justice, for him, wasn't reserved for allies. Even those who had opposed him could expect fair treatment if captured. He regularly pardoned individuals who had plotted against him, understanding that mercy often broke cycles of vengeance more effectively than punishment. He was deeply committed to the teachings of Islam, but his interpretation emphasized integrity, compassion, and balance. He fasted regularly, studied religious texts, and surrounded himself with scholars, not flatterers. His court valued knowledge over appearance. He asked hard questions and expected honest answers. When confronted with moral dilemmas, he deferred to learned jurists rather than personal instincts. This reliance on ethics over impulse defined every policy he enacted. His conduct during negotiations with Richard the Lionheart became a turning point in the history of diplomacy. Though their armies clashed repeatedly, Saladin maintained a level of respect uncommon in warfare. He ensured that Christian pilgrims could access holy sites even before formal treaties were signed. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 replacements. When the English king suffered illness, he offered his personal doctor. These actions weren't weakness, they were demonstrations of strength rooted in honor. His sense of purpose extended beyond victory. He believed peace, when earned, carried greater weight than conquest. Leadership, for him, was inseparable from self-control. He never allowed emotion to dictate action. When faced with betrayal, he responded with caution, not rage. When his own soldiers showed cruelty, he reprimanded them openly. In his eyes, the moral weight of leadership was heavier than the crown. His goal wasn't to be feared, it was to be remembered for right conduct in moments of temptation. He held his own army to higher standards than those of his enemies. He took special care to protect civilians during military campaigns. Before launching any siege, he offered peaceful surrender. If it was accepted, inhabitants were treated with decency. If it was refused, and the city taken, he insisted on protecting women, children, and the elderly. Looting was restricted. Orders were clear. Soldiers were reminded that they represented not just a ruler, but a code. This sense of discipline was rare, even in his time. He devoted resources to public welfare, repairing aqueducts, supporting hospitals, and funding education. He revived infrastructure in cities ravaged by war, ensuring markets could reopen and homes be rebuilt. Refugees were given food, clothing, and safe passage. His governance created stability where chaos had previously thrived. He believed strength should benefit the weak first. Even in the final years of his life, he remained consistent. He refused to hoard gold or build grand palaces. Visitors to his camp found him approachable, dressed in simple robes, often overseeing daily affairs himself. When asked about his lifestyle, he would say, "A ruler who forgets his people forgets himself." He saw no value in separation from the common man. That connection made his leadership human, not abstract. His vision extended beyond borders. He supported scholars, poets, and theologians, creating an atmosphere where ideas could grow alongside statecraft. He encouraged discussions across sects, promoting unity over dogma. In his view, divisions among Muslims had weakened their world, and healing required understanding, not force. He worked tirelessly to mend those rifts, often through personal diplomacy and shared objectives rather than imposed doctrine. He left behind more than victories. He left a model of what ethical leadership could achieve. In every action, from battlefield decisions to daily governance, Saladin showed that character, not conquest, defines greatness. He did not seek fame, yet his name endured. He did not seek wealth, yet his generosity outlived him. He did not pursue dominance, yet his presence brought stability. What made him extraordinary was not how many cities he took, but how many hearts he won. In a world torn by ambition and betrayal, he stood as proof that mercy, when rooted in principle, is not a weakness, but the highest form of strength. In 1193, Saladin took his final breath in Damascus. He died not surrounded by gold, but by prayer. Despite ruling over an empire that stretched across 3 regions, he left behind barely enough wealth to pay for his burial. His personal treasury was empty because he had spent most of it on the poor, the sick, and the cause he believed in. His funeral was simple. No lavish procession, no grand display. Just the passing of a man who had lived his life in service rather than splendor. Those who attended the ceremony wept not for the fall of a king, but for the departure of a man who had led with conscience. After his death, rulers in both the Muslim and Christian worlds acknowledged his unmatched sense of justice. Chroniclers who had once painted him as a threat rewrote their words in respect. Even his enemies spoke of him with honor. He had become the rare figure whose legacy crossed borders, cultures, and beliefs. His character had outlasted the wars he fought. For generations, his name would be invoked not to inspire fear, but to remind others of what moral strength looked like. Saladin's legacy didn't depend on monuments. It was carried forward in principles, fair rule, humility, and unwavering commitment to mercy. He redefined the expectations of leadership in a time dominated by greed and violence. He showed that victory without cruelty was possible, that peace could be pursued without compromising one's position, and that dignity should never be reserved for a select few. Even as his military achievements faded into memory, his ethical example grew stronger. Future leaders studied his methods not just for strategy, but for the values behind them. His life became a reference point, an answer to the question of whether power could coexist with virtue. In the centuries that followed, poets wrote of him, historians recorded his deeds, and philosophers reflected on his choices. Saladin had become a mirror in which rulers measured themselves. His model of restraint in victory left a permanent mark. When he reclaimed Jerusalem, he did not seek revenge. He avoided repeating the horrors of the First Crusade. That moment alone shifted the moral tone of history. It wasn't only the return of a holy city, it was the demonstration that justice could defeat vengeance. The act resonated across generations, becoming a blueprint for leadership governed by ethics rather than anger. He also influenced diplomacy in an age defined by conflict. His correspondence with European leaders, especially Richard the Lionheart, laid the groundwork for more civil engagement between hostile powers. He proved that even amidst war, respect could exist. Dialogue could continue. Treaties could be honored. His decisions gave future statesmen a foundation for negotiation that went beyond power games. More than a political figure, he became a moral compass. In cultures beyond his own, Saladin was portrayed as the noble adversary. Christian writers in medieval Europe described him not as a villain, but as the embodiment of honor. He appeared in literature, not as a symbol of the enemy, but as an ideal of what rulers should be. This shift in narrative was unprecedented. It elevated him to a place in global memory that very few conquerors ever reach. In the Muslim world, his legacy served as a rallying point for unity. He had shown that fragmented communities could overcome division when led with wisdom. His life reminded future generations that strength didn't come from domination, but from shared purpose and disciplined leadership. His example offered a way forward when others sought only short-term gains through brutal means. Centuries later, leaders, generals, and philosophers continued to quote him. Not for military tactics, but for the clarity of his conduct. In times of crisis, his name resurfaced as a reminder of balanced leadership. He remained relevant not because of the cities he controlled, but because of the character he carried. He became proof that history remembers more than victories. It remembers the values that shape them. In Saladin, the world witnessed a rare fusion: strategy without cruelty, faith without fanaticism, authority without arrogance. His life answered one of humanity's oldest questions: can power serve good without becoming corrupted? He showed it can. He never declared himself the greatest. He never claimed divine right. He led not by proclaiming superiority, but by embodying integrity. And that, more than his battles or borders, is what endured. He left behind no empire of gold, but a reputation richer than any crown could offer. A legacy carved not in stone, but in the minds and hearts of those who believe that true greatness begins where pride ends.